In this video, we're taking a closer look at Weapons, 2025, one of the most talked about horror mysteries in recent years. Directed by Zach Cregger, the filmmaker behind Barbarian, this movie begins with a chilling premise. A group of children mysteriously disappear during the same night, leaving an entire community searching for answers. But as the story unfolds, it becomes clear that this is much more than a simple missing person case. With a talented cast led by Garner and Josh Brolin, strong performances, unsettling atmosphere, and a mystery that keeps getting stranger, Weapons aims to deliver something that stays with you long after the credits roll. So today, we'll be diving into the story, the performances, the direction, the cinematography, and some interesting facts behind the film to find out whether Weapons lives up to the massive expectations surrounding it. Let's begin. When I first sat down to watch Weapons, I thought I had a pretty good idea of what kind of movie I was getting into. The marketing leaned heavily into mystery, the trailers showed children walking out of their homes in the middle of the night, and the entire premise seemed built around a single question: where did all these kids go? But what surprised me almost immediately was how little interest the film has in giving easy answers. Instead of rushing toward the mystery, director Zach Cregger takes his time creating an atmosphere where every ordinary detail starts to feel unsettling. The opening sections of the movie are incredibly effective because nothing looks unusual on the surface. We are introduced to a quiet community, familiar streets, ordinary homes, and parents who seem to be living normal lives. Then one night, at exactly 2:17 in the morning, almost every child from the same classroom leaves home and disappears without a trace. The image itself is terrifying because it is so simple. There are no monsters jumping out of the shadows, no loud horror cliches, and no immediate explanation. The children simply walk away. That idea alone creates more fear than many horror movies manage in their entire runtime. According to the film's premise, all but one child from the same class vanish during the same night, leaving an entire community desperate for answers. One of the things that impressed me early on was how confident Zach Cregger feels as a filmmaker. After the success of Barbarian, expectations for his next project were extremely high, and it would have been easy for him to simply repeat what worked before. Instead, Weapons feels larger, stranger, and far more ambitious. The movie uses multiple perspectives to tell its story, allowing different characters to reveal pieces of the mystery from their own point of view. That structure could have become confusing very quickly, but the film handles it surprisingly well. Every new perspective changes the way we look at previous events. A scene that seemed straightforward suddenly takes on a completely different meaning once another character enters the picture. Several critics compared this storytelling style to films like Magnolia, and after watching the movie, I can understand why. The narrative keeps expanding outward, revealing connections that were hidden from the audience earlier. Garner plays one of the most important roles in the story, and her performance is one of the main reasons the film works emotionally. She brings a level of vulnerability that makes her character feel believable even when the events around her become increasingly bizarre. Horror movies often struggle to create characters that feel like real people, but Garner manages to ground the film whenever things start drifting into nightmare territory. Josh Brolin also delivers a strong performance. He has the difficult task of portraying a man whose life is being torn apart by circumstances he cannot understand, and there is a constant tension in his performance that keeps you invested. What I appreciated most is that neither actor feels like they are trying to dominate the movie. This is very much an ensemble piece, and the cast works together to create a community that feels damaged, frightened, and increasingly desperate. The final cast ultimately included Josh Brolin, Garner, Alden Ehrenreich, Benedict Wong, Amy Madigan, Abrams, and several others after earlier casting plans changed during production. Visually, the movie is gorgeous in a way that almost feels wrong considering how disturbing the material is. The cinematography constantly places familiar suburban locations into uncomfortable contexts. Empty streets feel threatening. School hallways feel haunted. Living rooms become places of dread. The camera often lingers just long enough to make you question whether something is hiding in the frame. I found myself scanning the background of scenes looking for clues even when nothing obvious was happening. That is a sign of effective visual storytelling. The film understands that horror is often created through anticipation rather than shock. The audience begins imagining threats before the movie even reveals them. This approach gives the entire experience an uneasy feeling that never fully disappears. Behind the camera, Cregger worked with cinematographer Larkin Sepel, whose visual style plays a major role in creating the film's atmosphere. Another thing worth mentioning is how carefully the movie handles information. Many modern mystery films are terrified of losing the audience, so they constantly explain themselves. Weapons does the opposite. It trusts viewers to pay attention. Questions are raised long before answers arrive, and even then, the film does not hand everything over neatly. Some people will probably find that frustrating, but I personally enjoyed it. The uncertainty becomes part of the experience. You are not just watching characters search for answers. You are searching alongside them. Every conversation feels important because you never know which detail might matter later. Every strange moment feels like a clue. That level of engagement kept me invested throughout the film. What makes the central mystery especially effective is the emotional impact it has on the community. The disappearance of children is not treated as a simple plot device. The movie spends time exploring the fear, confusion, and suspicion that follow. Relationships begin to crack under pressure. People start blaming each other. Rumors spread. Trust disappears. Those reactions feel believable because the film understands that the scariest part of a mystery is often not the mystery itself but the effect it has on ordinary people. As the search for answers continues, the town slowly transforms into a place where nobody feels safe anymore. One interesting production fact is that Weapons became one of the most talked about horror projects in Hollywood long before cameras started rolling. Following the success of Barbarian, studios entered an intense bidding war for Zach Cregger's screenplay. The project eventually landed at New Line Cinema, showing just how much confidence the industry had in both the script and the filmmaker behind it. Cregger later described the story as deeply personal, drawing inspiration from grief and personal loss while also taking influence from films such as Magnolia and Prisoners. Knowing that background adds another layer to the viewing experience because the movie often feels less interested in simple scares and more interested in exploring emotional wounds that never fully heal. As the investigation begins to expand, the film becomes much more than a simple missing children mystery. What I found particularly interesting is how Weapons slowly shifts the audience's attention away from the question of where the children went and toward the people left behind. The disappearance itself is horrifying, but the emotional fallout becomes equally important. Parents who were once friendly neighbors suddenly start looking at each other with suspicion. Every conversation feels loaded with tension because everyone is searching for someone to blame. The movie understands that human beings struggle to accept uncertainty. When there are no answers, people create their own explanations, and those explanations often become more dangerous than the truth. Watching the town gradually fracture under pressure is one of the most compelling aspects of the film. It feels authentic because fear rarely brings people together for long. Eventually, fear starts pulling them apart. One of the strongest storytelling choices involves the way information is distributed among different characters. Rather than following a single protagonist from beginning to end, the narrative keeps shifting perspectives. Normally, that kind of structure can feel distracting, but here it works because each character is carrying a different piece of the puzzle. One person notices something unusual that another completely overlooks. Someone else's memory of an event contradicts what we thought we knew earlier. These shifts force the audience to constantly reevaluate their assumptions. More importantly, they create the feeling that nobody truly understands what is happening. Everyone is operating with incomplete information, including us. That uncertainty gives the movie a sense of realism despite the increasingly strange events unfolding on screen. Julia Garner continues to be one of the film's strongest assets during these sections. What impressed me most about her performance is how restrained it feels. Many actors would be tempted to push every emotional scene to its absolute limit, but Garner rarely overplays a moment. Instead, she allows small reactions, brief silences, and subtle expressions to communicate what her character is going through. There are scenes where she appears completely exhausted, as though the emotional weight of the situation has drained every ounce of energy from her. Those moments feel incredibly believable. They remind us that trauma is not always loud. Sometimes it appears as quiet helplessness. Her performance keeps the story grounded whenever the mystery threatens to become overwhelming. Josh Brolin brings a very different energy to the film. His character responds to uncertainty with frustration and determination, creating a contrast that works extremely well. There is a growing sense that he refuses to accept the official explanations being offered around him. Every time he appears on screen, you get the feeling that he is pushing against something larger than himself. Brolin has always been effective at portraying characters carrying enormous internal pressure, and that skill is on full display here. Even when he says very little, his body language communicates constant tension. The result is a performance that feels powerful without ever becoming theatrical. As the mystery deepens, Zach Cregger demonstrates an impressive understanding of visual storytelling. Some of the film's most effective scenes contain very little dialogue. Instead, they rely on composition, lighting, and atmosphere to create unease. There are moments where the camera simply observes an empty location for several seconds longer than expected. Nothing jumps out. Nothing immediately happens. Yet the tension becomes almost unbearable because the audience has learned not to trust ordinary spaces. This approach reminds me of some of the best psychological horror films, where the fear comes not from what is visible but from what might be hiding just outside the frame. The sound design deserves significant credit as well. Horror audiences often focus on music, but effective sound design can be even more important. Throughout Weapons, ordinary sounds are subtly manipulated to create discomfort. Footsteps seem slightly too loud. Silence lasts slightly too long. Background noises occasionally feel unnatural without becoming obviously supernatural. These details work on a subconscious level. You may not notice them immediately, but they constantly influence how you experience each scene. The result is a film that feels unsettling even during relatively calm moments. What makes these middle sections particularly effective is the growing realization that the disappearance may not have a simple explanation. Early in the movie, there is still a possibility that the mystery could be solved through conventional means. As more information emerges, that possibility begins to fade. Characters encounter details that refuse to fit into any logical framework. Certain events seem impossible, yet they continue occurring. The film never rushes this transition. Instead, it carefully guides the audience from uncertainty into genuine dread. By the time the story starts hinting at darker possibilities, we are already emotionally invested enough to follow wherever it leads. Another aspect I appreciated is the movie's refusal to treat children as mere plot devices. In many mystery stories, missing children exist primarily to motivate adult characters. Here, the children feel like actual people whose absence leaves visible scars throughout the community. Their empty classrooms, abandoned belongings, and grieving families become constant reminders of what has been lost. This attention to emotional consequences helps the film avoid becoming a simple puzzle box. Solving the mystery matters because real lives have been shattered. A fascinating fact about the production is how much confidence the studio placed in Zach Cregger's vision. Reports surrounding the film's development suggested that multiple studios aggressively pursued the screenplay after reading it, creating one of the industry's most competitive bidding situations for a horror project in recent years. That level of interest is unusual, especially for an original horror story not connected to an existing franchise. It reflects how strongly people responded to the script long before the public had any idea what the movie was actually about. The success of Barbarian certainly helped open doors, but it was the screenplay itself that reportedly generated extraordinary enthusiasm among executives and producers. As these sections unfold, it becomes increasingly clear that Weapons is interested in something deeper than simply frightening its audience. Beneath the mystery lies a story about grief, fear, obsession, and the desperate human need for answers. Every character seems to be searching for certainty in a world that refuses to provide it. That emotional foundation gives the film weight. Without it, the mystery would still be intriguing. With it, the story becomes genuinely affecting. The audience is not just curious about what happened. We begin to understand why finding the truth matters so much to the people involved. By this point in the film, what really stood out to me was how carefully Zach Cregger controls the pace. A lot of modern horror movies become impatient once the mystery is established. They start throwing answers, twists, and shocking reveals at the audience because they are afraid viewers might lose interest. Weapons takes the opposite approach. It understands that anticipation is often more powerful than revelation. The movie continues adding layers to the mystery without fully explaining any of them, creating a feeling that the characters are walking deeper and deeper into something they do not understand. Every answer seems to generate two new questions. Instead of reducing tension, new discoveries actually increase it. One of the most effective elements during this stretch of the story is the growing sense that the community itself is becoming unstable. At the beginning of the movie, people were united by confusion and concern. Now those emotions are evolving into suspicion, anger, and paranoia. Some residents believe there is a rational explanation waiting to be uncovered. Others become convinced that something far more disturbing is responsible. The divide between those viewpoints creates conflict that feels natural rather than forced. When people experience a tragedy they cannot explain, they rarely agree on how to respond. The film captures that reality extremely well. There are several scenes where characters attempt to piece together timelines, compare witness accounts, and identify connections between seemingly unrelated events. Normally these investigative sequences could become repetitive, but the screenplay keeps them engaging because each new clue changes the emotional landscape. Information is never presented simply for the sake of advancing the plot. Every revelation affects relationships, alters perceptions, or forces characters to confront uncomfortable possibilities. That balance between mystery and emotion is one of the film's greatest strengths. Alden Ehrenreich deserves recognition for the way he fits into the ensemble. His role is not as immediately flashy as some of the others, but he brings an important sense of realism to the story. One thing I noticed throughout the film is that almost every major character reacts differently to fear. Some become aggressive. Some withdraw emotionally. Some become obsessed with finding answers. Ehrenreich's performance captures a person trying to maintain control while slowly realizing that control may be impossible. It is a subtle performance, but subtle performances are often the ones that stay with you the longest. The film's visual language also becomes more ambitious as the story progresses. Earlier scenes relied heavily on ordinary locations made unsettling through atmosphere. Now the cinematography starts embracing more striking imagery. Certain shots feel almost dreamlike, yet they never become disconnected from the story's emotional core. This balance is difficult to achieve. Many horror films introduce surreal visuals that look impressive but ultimately feel meaningless. In Weapons, even the most unusual images seem connected to the themes of loss, fear, and uncertainty. They are not included simply because they look cool. They serve a purpose. Larkin Siepel's cinematography deserves a great deal of credit here. The camera often frames characters in ways that emphasize isolation. Even when people are standing together, they frequently appear emotionally separated from one another. Empty spaces dominate many compositions, creating a visual reminder of the children who are no longer present. These choices might seem small when viewed individually, but together they create a consistent atmosphere that strengthens every scene. Another aspect I appreciated was the movie's confidence in silence. Hollywood films often feel uncomfortable with quiet moments. There is usually dialogue, music, or action filling every second. Weapons is willing to sit with uncomfortable stillness. Some of the film's most memorable scenes involve characters simply processing information or reacting to events that have changed their lives forever. Those moments allow the audience to absorb the emotional consequences of what is happening rather than immediately moving on to the next plot point. The score plays an important role during these scenes as well. Instead of constantly announcing danger, the music often operates in the background, creating a sense of unease without demanding attention. When the soundtrack finally becomes more prominent, it feels earned. The contrast between silence and music makes certain moments hit much harder than they otherwise would have. Good film music is not just about creating memorable melodies. It is about understanding when to remain invisible and when to step forward. Weapons demonstrates that understanding repeatedly. As more pieces of the puzzle emerge, the movie also starts exploring the psychological impact of obsession. Several characters become consumed by the need to understand what happened. At first, their determination feels admirable. The audience wants answers too. But gradually the film begins showing how dangerous obsession can become. The search for truth starts affecting relationships, decision-making, and emotional stability. Characters who initially seemed reasonable begin making increasingly questionable choices. The mystery is no longer something they are investigating. It becomes something that controls their lives. This thematic focus gives the story additional depth. The film is not simply asking where the children went. It is asking what people are willing to sacrifice in order to find out. That distinction becomes increasingly important as events continue unfolding. Every major character faces moments where they must choose between protecting themselves and pursuing answers. Those choices reveal who they really are. One fascinating production detail is that many industry insiders reportedly considered the screenplay one of the most sought-after horror scripts in years before filming even began. The excitement surrounding the project was so intense that trade publications covered the bidding war almost like a major Hollywood event. That kind of attention creates enormous pressure because audiences inevitably expect something special. Watching the finished film, it becomes easier to understand why the script generated such enthusiasm. The story is not built around a single shocking idea. It is built around a mystery that continually evolves, revealing new dimensions while maintaining emotional credibility. What impressed me most during this portion of the movie was the growing realization that no character possesses the complete picture. Everyone is operating with fragments of information. Everyone believes they understand more than they actually do. That uncertainty extends to the audience as well. Even when the film appears to provide answers, there is always a lingering sense that something important remains hidden. That feeling keeps the tension alive and prevents the narrative from becoming predictable. By the end of these sections, the atmosphere has changed dramatically from where the film began. What started as a tragic mystery has evolved into something much darker and far more unsettling. The questions are becoming larger. The stakes are becoming higher. And perhaps most importantly, the possibility of a simple explanation is becoming increasingly difficult to believe. As the film moves deeper into its narrative, one of the most interesting developments is how it begins challenging the audience's assumptions about cause and effect. Earlier sections encouraged us to believe that if enough clues were collected, the mystery could eventually be solved in a straightforward way. By now, that confidence has started to disappear. Characters continue uncovering information, but the more they learn, the less certain they become. Every discovery seems to open another door rather than close one. I found myself constantly reconsidering earlier scenes, wondering whether details that seemed insignificant at the time were actually far more important than I realized. What makes this progression so effective is that the screenplay never feels like it is deliberately trying to confuse the audience. There is a major difference between complexity and chaos. Some mystery films throw random twists at viewers simply to appear clever. Weapons feels far more disciplined than that. Even when the story becomes increasingly strange, there is a sense that every development is connected to a larger design. The audience may not understand that design yet, but it feels present. That confidence from the filmmakers allows viewers to remain engaged even when answers remain out of reach. A significant strength of the movie is the way it handles fear. Most horror films focus on immediate danger. Characters are being chased, attacked, or threatened. Weapons often explores a different type of fear entirely. It is the fear of uncertainty. The fear of not knowing where someone is. The fear of realizing that the world may operate according to rules you do not understand. Those anxieties tend to linger much longer than simple jump scares because they tap into real human experiences. Almost everyone understands what it feels like to search for answers and find only more questions. The performances continue carrying much of the emotional weight. Julia Garner remains exceptional because she consistently avoids predictable choices. There are moments where another actor might have delivered a dramatic speech or emotional breakdown. Garner often chooses restraint instead. Her reactions feel authentic because they resemble how real people process overwhelming situations. Sometimes she appears determined. Sometimes exhausted. Sometimes completely lost. That emotional variety prevents the character from becoming one-dimensional. Josh Brolin's performance becomes increasingly compelling as pressure mounts around him. One thing I appreciated is how the film allows frustration to build gradually. He does not suddenly transform into a different person. Instead, we watch stress accumulate over time. Every disappointment, every dead end, and every unanswered question adds another layer of tension. By showing that progression rather than skipping directly to the result, the movie makes his decisions feel understandable even when they become questionable. The supporting cast deserves recognition as well. Ensemble stories often struggle because secondary characters exist only to support the main narrative. Here, many of them feel like individuals with their own fears, motivations, and perspectives. Even relatively brief scenes contribute to the sense that this community existed before the mystery began and will continue dealing with its consequences afterward. That attention to character work makes the world feel more believable. Visually, the film becomes even more confident. Several sequences rely heavily on atmosphere rather than exposition. There are scenes where the camera moves through locations connected to the disappearances, allowing the audience to absorb details without anyone explicitly explaining their significance. This approach rewards attentive viewers. Rather than telling us what to think, the film encourages us to observe and draw conclusions ourselves. Lighting plays a particularly important role during these sections. Darkness is used effectively, but what impressed me more was how the movie handles daylight. Many horror films feel safe whenever the sun is shining. Weapons rejects that idea. Daytime scenes often feel just as unsettling as nighttime sequences. The mystery follows the characters everywhere. There is no sense of relief simply because the environment is brighter. That choice helps maintain tension throughout the film instead of restricting it to traditional horror settings. Another aspect worth discussing is the movie's treatment of memory. Several characters spend a great deal of time revisiting past events, trying to identify moments they may have overlooked. This creates an interesting dynamic because memories are rarely as reliable as people believe. Different individuals remember the same situation differently. Certain details become exaggerated while others disappear completely. The film uses this reality to create uncertainty without feeling manipulative. Characters are not necessarily lying. They are simply human. This theme ties directly into the broader ideas running beneath the mystery. The story is not only about discovering the truth. It is also about understanding how people construct their own versions of reality. When faced with something frightening, individuals naturally search for explanations that make them feel safe. Some embrace logic. Others turn towards superstition. Others become consumed by conspiracy theories. The movie explores all of these responses while avoiding simplistic judgments. One thing I found particularly impressive was the film's willingness to trust its audience. There are moments where important information is presented quietly rather than dramatically. No character pauses to explain why a detail matters. No musical cue announces that a major clue has appeared. The filmmakers assume viewers are paying attention. That trust creates a more rewarding experience because discoveries feel earned rather than delivered. Behind the scenes, it is easy to see why the project attracted so much attention during development. Horror has become one of the most creative genres in modern filmmaking, but original concepts still face challenges in a marketplace dominated by sequels and established franchises. The fact that Weapons generated enormous interest before production even began speaks to the strength of the screenplay and the industry's confidence in Zach Cregger as a storyteller. Success can sometimes make directors more cautious, but this film often feels like the work of someone willing to take risks. As these sections draw to a close, the emotional atmosphere becomes heavier than ever. The mystery is no longer a distant problem affecting a handful of people. It has transformed into something that influences every aspect of the community. Relationships continue deteriorating. Fear continues spreading. And perhaps most unsettling of all, there is a growing sense that the characters may be approaching answers they are not prepared to hear. The closer they get to the truth, the more dangerous that truth begins to feel. By this stage of the movie, what impressed me most was how effectively it maintained tension without relying on constant shocks. Many horror films reach a point where they start revealing everything too quickly because they are afraid the audience's curiosity will fade. Weapons shows remarkable patience. Instead of rushing toward answers, it continues exploring the emotional and psychological consequences of the mystery. That decision pays off because the audience becomes invested in the characters rather than simply the solution. We want to know what happened, of course, but we also care about what the search is doing to the people involved. One of the strongest ideas running through the film is the gradual collapse of certainty. Early on, several characters believe they understand how the world works. They trust evidence, routines, and familiar explanations. As the mystery grows more complicated, those beliefs begin to break down. People who once seemed confident become uncertain. People who demanded proof start considering possibilities they would have dismissed earlier. This transformation happens slowly enough to feel believable. The film never asks characters to abandon logic overnight. Instead, it shows how prolonged exposure to the unexplained can change the way someone thinks. That theme is reflected beautifully in the performances. Julia Garner continues delivering one of the most emotionally layered performances in the film. What makes her work so effective is the way she communicates internal conflict. There are moments where her character clearly wants to believe one explanation while simultaneously fearing another. You can see the struggle in her expressions long before she speaks about it. Those details make the performance feel lived in rather than performed. Josh Brolin, meanwhile, brings an intensity that becomes increasingly important as events escalate. His character is driven by a desperate need for certainty, and that need starts influencing every decision he makes. One thing I appreciated is that the movie never presents obsession as something heroic. The desire for answers is understandable, but the film constantly reminds us that obsession has consequences. Relationships suffer. Judgment becomes clouded. Emotional wounds deepen. Brolin captures those changes exceptionally well. As the investigation expands, the screenplay begins introducing details that seem disconnected at first glance. Normally, this approach can feel frustrating if the audience senses the writer is withholding information purely for dramatic effect. Here, however, the fragments feel purposeful. Every clue appears to belong to a larger pattern that has not fully revealed itself yet. The audience is encouraged to participate in the process, connecting details and forming theories alongside the characters. This is where Zach Cregger's direction becomes especially impressive. He understands that mystery is not simply about hiding information. It is about deciding when and how information should be revealed. Throughout these sections, the film carefully balances answers and questions. Just as viewers begin feeling overwhelmed by uncertainty, a new piece of information arrives. Just as confidence starts returning, another complication emerges. The result is a narrative that constantly moves forward while preserving suspense. The visual storytelling remains one of the film's greatest strengths. Several sequences during this portion rely almost entirely on atmosphere. Characters move through familiar locations that now feel transformed by fear and memory. Places that once seemed ordinary carry emotional weight because of what has happened there. The camera often lingers on details connected to the missing children, reminding viewers that their absence remains at the center of everything. I found it particularly effective how the film uses empty spaces. An empty classroom. An abandoned playground. A quiet neighborhood street. These locations are not inherently frightening, yet the movie turns them into powerful symbols of loss. Rather than showing constant scenes of grief, it allows environments to communicate what words cannot. That approach demonstrates a level of confidence that many films lack. The sound design deserves further praise here because it continues shaping the atmosphere in subtle ways. Certain scenes contain almost no music at all, forcing the audience to focus on environmental sounds. A door closing, distant footsteps, a faint noise in the background. Individually, these sounds mean very little, but together they create a feeling that something is always slightly wrong. Horror often works best when it operates beneath conscious awareness, and Weapons understands that principle extremely well. Another element that stood out to me was the film's treatment of community. Many mysteries focus exclusively on a handful of central characters. Weapons repeatedly reminds us that an entire town is suffering. The disappearances affect schools, families, friendships, and public institutions. Every person seems to be carrying some version of the same fear. This broader perspective gives the story scale without requiring massive action sequences or spectacle. A fascinating aspect of the production is how much anticipation surrounded the project before audiences saw a single frame. Following the success of Barbarian, expectations were extraordinarily high. That kind of attention can become a burden because viewers often arrive with impossible standards. What impressed me while watching Weapons was that it never felt like a filmmaker trying to recreate a previous success. Instead, it felt like someone attempting to push further and explore bigger ideas. Whether every viewer agrees with the creative choices is another discussion entirely, but the ambition is undeniable. The screenplay also deserves credit for avoiding easy moral judgments. Characters make mistakes throughout the film. Some decisions are driven by fear. Others by anger, guilt, or desperation. Yet the movie rarely reduces people to heroes and villains. Most individuals are simply trying to survive an impossible situation. That complexity makes the story feel more mature than many genre films. Real crises often reveal flaws in otherwise decent people, and Weapons captures that reality effectively. As the narrative continues moving forward, there is a growing feeling that the mystery extends beyond any single event. The disappearance of the children remains the central question, but the story is gradually uncovering deeper issues beneath the surface. Hidden fears, unresolved grief, and long-buried tensions are beginning to emerge. The search for answers is no longer just an investigation. It has become a confrontation with truths that many characters would rather avoid. By the end of this section, the atmosphere feels heavier than ever. Every new clue seems to bring the characters closer to understanding what happened, yet that progress offers surprisingly little comfort. In fact, the opposite may be true. The closer they move toward the truth, the more unsettling the truth appears to become. The film creates the sense that some mysteries are frightening not because they cannot be solved, but because of what waits at the end of the solution. One thing I kept thinking about while watching this movie was how carefully it avoids giving the audience a comfortable place to stand. Usually, when a mystery gets deeper, you start feeling more confident about your theories. Here, the opposite happened. Every time I thought I had figured something out, another detail appeared that forced me to rethink everything. What makes that so effective is that the film never feels like it's playing games with the audience. The uncertainty feels earned because the characters are experiencing the exact same confusion. Nobody has a complete understanding of what's happening, and that shared uncertainty creates a strong connection between the audience and the people on screen. What really stood out to me during these scenes was how exhausted everyone looked. Not physically exhausted in the traditional sense, but emotionally drained. The search for answers has been going on for so long that it starts affecting every part of their lives. Conversations become shorter. Tempers become harder to control. Even ordinary interactions feel tense because everyone is carrying the weight of the same tragedy. The movie spends time showing these small changes, and those moments are just as important as the bigger revelations. Julia Garner continues to impress because she understands how to make silence meaningful. There are scenes where her character says very little, yet her face tells the audience everything they need to know. Fear, frustration, grief, confusion, determination. It all feels natural rather than performed. That's one of the reasons her performance works so well. She never seems aware that she's in a horror movie. She reacts like a real person trying to survive an impossible situation. Josh Brolin brings a completely different energy. The longer the mystery continues, the harder it becomes for him to accept uncertainty. I found that aspect of his character fascinating because it feels incredibly human. Most people can tolerate not knowing something for a short period of time. Stretch that uncertainty across days, weeks, or months, and it starts changing the way they think. Brolin captures that transformation beautifully. You can see a man who desperately wants control slowly realizing that control may not exist. There is also a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. Earlier in the film, the mystery felt distant, almost abstract. The children were gone, people were searching for answers, but there was still a sense that someone might eventually solve everything. That feeling becomes harder to hold on to. The closer people look, the stranger the situation appears. Instead of finding clarity, they discover contradictions. Instead of finding certainty, they uncover possibilities that are even more frightening. I really appreciated the way Zach Cregger handles these developments. Lesser directors might have rushed toward bigger scares or louder scenes. Instead, he allows tension to build naturally. Sometimes the most unsettling moments involve nothing more than a conversation, a memory, or a realization. The audience is not frightened because something jumps out of the darkness. They're frightened because they can feel the ground shifting beneath the characters. The cinematography plays a major role in creating that feeling. Several scenes place characters in large open spaces where they should feel safe, yet somehow they don't. The framing often makes people appear isolated even when others are nearby. It's a subtle technique, but it reinforces one of the film's central ideas. Everyone is experiencing the same tragedy, yet nobody can fully share the burden with someone else. Fear has a way of making people feel alone, and the visuals capture that perfectly. Another thing I noticed was how often the movie trusts the audience to connect dots on their own. Modern films sometimes explain every detail because they're worried viewers might miss something. Weapons shows much more confidence. Important information is often delivered casually, hidden inside conversations or background details. The film assumes you're paying attention. That approach makes the experience more rewarding because every discovery feels earned. The sound design remains incredibly effective. There are moments where the silence itself becomes uncomfortable. You find yourself listening closely, expecting something to happen, and sometimes nothing does. Yet the tension remains. Creating that kind of atmosphere is much harder than creating a simple jump scare. It requires patience and precision, both of which are present throughout the film. Something else that deserves praise is the way the movie handles emotional consequences. A lot of mysteries become so focused on solving the puzzle that they forget about the people affected by it. Here, the emotional damage is always present. Every new clue comes with a reminder of what's at stake. Families are still grieving. Friendships are still falling apart. Trust is still disappearing. The mystery matters because people matter. One production fact that makes this project even more interesting is the level of creative freedom Zach Cregger reportedly received after the success of Barbarian. Hollywood often rewards successful filmmakers, but that freedom can be a double-edged sword. Some directors become self-indulgent when given more control. Watching Weapons, I never got that impression. The film feels ambitious, but it also feels focused. Every strange moment, every unsettling image, and every narrative detour appears connected to a larger purpose. What kept pulling me back into the story was the feeling that everyone was chasing answers for different reasons. Some characters want closure. Some want justice. Some simply want the uncertainty to end. Those motivations create conflicts that feel authentic because they're rooted in emotion rather than plot mechanics. People are not moving through the story because the screenplay needs them to. They're making decisions based on fear, grief, hope, and desperation. The deeper the investigation goes, the harder it becomes to separate truth from assumption. Characters begin questioning things they once accepted without hesitation. Memories are re-examined. Relationships are tested. Long-held beliefs start crumbling under pressure. Watching that process unfold is one of the most compelling aspects of the movie because it reminds us that certainty can be surprisingly fragile. Sometimes all it takes is one unexplained event to make people question everything they thought they understood about the world around them. The longer I watched Weapons, the more I realized that the film is not interested in making the audience comfortable. Even when characters discover something important, there is never a feeling of relief. If anything, each discovery seems to make the situation more disturbing. That's a difficult balance to maintain because mysteries usually work by reducing uncertainty over time. Here, uncertainty changes shape instead of disappearing. Questions evolve. Assumptions collapse. Details that once seemed insignificant start looking incredibly important. What I found especially effective was the way fear spreads through the community. Nobody needs to see something supernatural or impossible to become frightened. Rumors alone are enough. People start sharing theories, and those theories take on lives of their own. Some believe they understand what's happening. Others become convinced that nobody understands anything at all. The result is a town where almost every conversation feels tense because everyone is working with a different version of reality. That idea connects directly to one of the film's strongest themes. Human beings hate uncertainty. We naturally search for explanations because explanations make us feel safer. The problem is that people will often accept the wrong explanation before accepting no explanation at all. Weapons explores that tendency in fascinating ways. Characters become attached to theories not because those theories are necessarily correct, but because they provide emotional comfort. Watching those beliefs collide creates some of the film's most interesting dramatic moments. Julia Garner continues delivering an incredibly grounded performance. One thing I noticed is how often she communicates emotion through reaction rather than action. Many actors focus on the moment they're speaking. Garner is equally compelling when she's listening. You can see her character processing information, questioning assumptions, and struggling to hold herself together. Those details might sound small, but they're part of what makes the performance feel authentic. Josh Brolin remains equally impressive for different reasons. His character is driven by an urgent need to find answers, and that urgency becomes more intense with every passing scene. What makes the performance work is that Brolin never turns that determination into something simple or heroic. There are moments where his obsession helps move the investigation forward, and there are moments where it clearly causes harm. The movie understands that desperation can be both useful and dangerous at the same time. I also found myself paying closer attention to the visual details as the film continued. Zach Cregger and cinematographer Larkin Sepel fill many scenes with subtle information. Certain objects appear repeatedly. Certain locations gain new meaning after later revelations. Background details that seem unimportant during one scene suddenly become significant later. This approach rewards viewers who stay engaged instead of passively waiting for answers. The use of space remains particularly impressive. Empty locations continue carrying enormous emotional weight. a hallway, a classroom, a quiet street. These places are not frightening because of what is happening there in the present. They are frightening because of what happened there in the past. The film understands that absence can sometimes feel more powerful than presence. Every empty space becomes a reminder of the people who should be there but are not. One thing that separates Weapons from many modern horror films is its confidence in atmosphere. There are scenes where almost nothing happens on a plot level, yet the tension remains incredibly strong. The movie is willing to spend time with uncertainty. It allows viewers to sit with uncomfortable emotions rather than immediately distracting them with another twist or scare. That patience will probably divide audiences. Some viewers prefer constant movement. Personally, I appreciated the restraint because it made the eventual revelations feel more meaningful. The soundtrack deserves recognition as well. Instead of overwhelming scenes with dramatic music, it often operates quietly in the background. Sometimes the score barely announces its presence at all. Then, when the music does become more noticeable, it carries real impact. The film understands that sound works best when it serves emotion rather than competing with it. Something else I admired was the way the screenplay handles coincidence. In weaker mysteries, strange events often feel random. Here, even the most unusual developments seem connected to something larger. The audience may not fully understand those connections yet, but there is a consistent feeling that every detail matters. That sense of purpose keeps the story engaging because viewers trust that their attention is being rewarded. A fascinating production detail involves the expectations surrounding the project before its release. After Barbarian became one of the most discussed horror films of its year, many people wondered whether Zach Cregger could deliver something equally memorable. That's a difficult position for any filmmaker. Success creates pressure. Audiences start expecting bigger surprises, bigger ideas, and bigger risks. What impressed me while watching Weapons was that it never felt like a director trying to outdo himself simply for the sake of it. The ambition grows naturally from the story being told. The emotional core of the movie also becomes clearer. Beneath all the mystery and tension, this is ultimately a story about people struggling with loss and uncertainty. Different characters respond in different ways. Some become obsessed with finding answers. Some withdraw emotionally. Some cling desperately to hope even when hope seems unreasonable. Those reactions make the story feel human regardless of how strange events become. As more information starts coming to light, nobody seems entirely sure whether they want the truth anymore. That feeling fascinated me because it reflects a real aspect of human nature. People often believe they want answers, but answers can carry consequences. Sometimes the truth changes the way we see ourselves, the people around us, and the world we thought we understood. The closer these characters move toward understanding what happened, the more they seem to realize that understanding may come with a price. And that's where the movie becomes especially compelling. The mystery is no longer just about discovering missing pieces of information. It becomes a question of what people are willing to confront once those pieces finally come together. Some doors can be opened. The harder question is whether anyone is prepared for what they might find on the other side. One of the things I kept coming back to while watching Weapons was how much trust the film places in its audience. It never feels desperate to keep reminding viewers what happened 5 minutes earlier. Instead, it assumes you're paying attention, and because of that, even small details start carrying weight. A passing comment suddenly feels important. A brief reaction from a character sticks in your mind longer than expected. There were several moments where I caught myself remembering scenes from much earlier in the movie because a new piece of information completely changed the way I interpreted them. What makes that approach so effective is that the mystery doesn't feel like a puzzle created for entertainment. It feels like something the characters are genuinely trapped inside. Their lives do not pause while they search for answers. They still have responsibilities, relationships, and emotional wounds that continue affecting them every day. The film spends time showing those consequences, and I think that's one of the reasons the story feels more grounded than many other horror mysteries. The emotional exhaustion becomes increasingly visible. People are not just scared anymore. They are tired. Tired of uncertainty. Tired of speculation. Tired of waking up every day without understanding what happened. That kind of fatigue is difficult to portray convincingly because it is quieter than fear or anger. Yet the cast handles it extremely well. You can see it in the way characters speak to one another. Conversations become shorter. Patience becomes harder to maintain. Even moments that should feel hopeful are overshadowed by doubt. Julia Garner continues to deliver some of the film's strongest scenes. What impressed me most here was her ability to make every emotional shift feel natural. Nothing appears forced. She never seems to be performing for the audience. Instead, she feels like someone carrying a burden that grows heavier every time she thinks she might finally put it down. There are scenes where her character receives information that should bring clarity, yet the reaction is far more complicated than simple relief. That complexity makes the performance memorable. Josh Brolin remains equally compelling because his character represents a different response to trauma. While some people begin questioning themselves, he pushes harder against the mystery. He becomes increasingly determined to find answers regardless of the cost. The movie wisely avoids presenting that determination as either entirely right or entirely wrong. Sometimes his persistence uncovers important truths. Other times it creates new problems. That balance prevents the character from becoming predictable. I also appreciated how the film continues developing its supporting cast. In many mysteries, secondary characters exist primarily to provide clues. Here, they feel like actual members of a community dealing with a shared crisis. Everyone has their own fears, theories, and emotional baggage. Even brief scenes contribute to the feeling that the disappearance of the children has touched every corner of this town. Visually, the movie remains incredibly confident. There are sequences where very little dialogue is used, yet the storytelling remains perfectly clear. A look between characters. A lingering shot of an empty location. A moment of hesitation before someone speaks. These details communicate just as much as pages of dialogue would. That's one of the advantages of strong visual filmmaking. The audience is allowed to observe rather than constantly being told what to think. The camera work continues reinforcing feelings of isolation and uncertainty. Characters often appear separated from one another even when they occupy the same space. Sometimes this separation is physical. Other times it feels emotional. Either way, the effect is powerful. The movie constantly reminds us that shared tragedy does not automatically create shared understanding. People may experience the same event while interpreting it in completely different ways. Another thing I noticed was how effectively the film uses ordinary environments. Horror often relies on obviously threatening locations, but Weapons finds tension in places that should feel safe. Schools, homes, streets, and public spaces all become sources of discomfort. Once fear enters a community, nowhere feels completely normal anymore. The movie captures that transformation extremely well. The sound design deserves praise once again because it continues doing a tremendous amount of work beneath the surface. There are scenes where almost nothing visually threatening occurs, yet the atmosphere remains incredibly tense. Much of that tension comes from subtle audio choices. Small sounds are given unusual emphasis. Silence arrives at unexpected moments. The result is a constant feeling that something is slightly out of place. One production fact that makes the film particularly interesting is how much discussion surrounded its screenplay long before audiences saw the finished movie. Industry reports suggested that readers responded strongly to the script's structure and ambition. Watching the film, it's easy to understand why. The story is constantly expanding, revealing new layers while maintaining emotional focus. Ambitious narratives often lose control of themselves as they grow larger. Weapons works hard to keep its characters at the center of everything. As more pieces of the mystery start aligning, another idea becomes increasingly important. The film is not simply asking what happened. It is asking how people live after something impossible enters their lives. Some characters are searching for closure. Others are searching for meaning. A few seem to be searching for proof that the world still makes sense. Those motivations overlap, conflict, and evolve throughout the story, creating drama that feels genuine rather than manufactured. What I found especially fascinating was the growing realization that answers alone may not solve anything. Throughout the movie, characters act as though understanding the truth will somehow repair the damage. Yet the closer they get to that truth, the clearer it becomes that knowledge and healing are not the same thing. Some wounds remain painful even after questions are answered. That idea gives the film a surprising amount of emotional depth. Beneath the mystery, beneath the horror, and beneath all the speculation, there is a story about people trying to rebuild their understanding of reality after it has been shattered. The investigation continues moving forward, but so does the emotional journey, and the two become increasingly impossible to separate. Every revelation changes not only what the characters know, but who they are becoming in response to it. The deeper this movie goes, the more I started appreciating how carefully it builds emotional pressure. A lot of mystery films focus almost entirely on uncovering information. Weapons certainly cares about its mystery, but it spends just as much time showing what uncertainty does to people. By now, it feels like every character is carrying some version of the same burden. Nobody knows exactly what happened, but everyone is being shaped by the absence of an answer. That shared uncertainty becomes one of the film's most powerful storytelling tools. Something I found particularly effective was the way trust continues eroding throughout the story. At the beginning, people were willing to work together because they believed the truth could be found through cooperation. As time passes, that optimism starts fading. Different theories emerge. Different priorities develop. People begin questioning each other's motives. The movie never exaggerates these conflicts for the sake of drama. Instead, it presents them as natural consequences of prolonged fear and frustration. What makes these interactions feel believable is the quality of the performances. Julia Garner remains one of the emotional anchors of the film. There are moments where her character appears completely overwhelmed, but she never loses the sense of realism that defines the performance. One thing I noticed is how often she communicates uncertainty. Many actors focus on certainty because certainty feels dramatic. Garner understands that confusion can be just as compelling. You can see her character struggling to decide what to believe, and that struggle feels genuine. Josh Brolin continues approaching the situation from a different angle. His character becomes increasingly convinced that answers exist somewhere, and that determination creates both strengths and weaknesses. There are scenes where his refusal to give up becomes admirable. There are other moments where the same quality pushes him toward risky decisions. The film never tells the audience how to judge him. It simply presents the consequences and allows viewers to draw their own conclusions. I also think the screenplay deserves credit for avoiding easy solutions. Many stories introduce complicated mysteries only to resolve them through convenient explanations. Here, every new answer feels earned because it emerges from careful groundwork established earlier in the film. Looking back, you can often trace important revelations to details that seemed insignificant at the time. That kind of structure requires discipline, and it rewards attentive viewers. The visual storytelling remains incredibly strong. There are several sequences where the camera appears almost observational, quietly watching characters process information or react to events. These moments allow emotions to develop naturally rather than being forced through exposition. Sometimes a character simply sits alone with their thoughts, and the scene becomes fascinating because the audience understands everything happening beneath the surface. One thing that impressed me was how often the movie finds tension without relying on traditional horror techniques. There are scenes that contain no obvious threats, no frightening imagery, and no sudden surprises, yet they remain deeply unsettling. The discomfort comes from context. The audience knows what these characters have experienced. We know what they are afraid of. That knowledge transforms even ordinary situations into sources of anxiety. The film's use of recurring imagery becomes increasingly noticeable as well. Certain visual elements appear throughout the story, gaining additional meaning each time they return. I won't get into every example because part of the enjoyment comes from recognizing these patterns yourself, but they help create a feeling that everything is connected. Nothing appears random. Even small details seem to belong to a larger design. The sound design continues playing a major role in establishing atmosphere. One thing I appreciated was the film's willingness to embrace silence. Silence can be uncomfortable because it forces viewers to focus. Without music guiding emotions or dialogue providing information, the audience becomes hyper-aware of every small detail. Weapons uses that discomfort effectively. Several scenes feel tense simply because the movie refuses to fill empty space with noise. Another aspect worth mentioning is the way the story handles grief. Grief is present from the very beginning, but it evolves as the narrative continues. Initially, many characters seem united by a common loss. As time passes, however, they begin processing that loss in different ways. Some become angry. Some become withdrawn. Some throw themselves into the search for answers. The movie understands that grief is rarely a shared experience, even when people are mourning the same thing. A fascinating production detail is the amount of anticipation that surrounded the project after Zach Cregger's previous success. Horror fans often become cautious when a filmmaker receives widespread praise because expectations can quickly become unrealistic. Watching Weapons, I got the impression that Cregger was less interested in repeating familiar tricks and more interested in exploring new ideas. The film feels larger in scope than Barbarian, but it also feels more emotionally focused in certain ways. The pacing deserves recognition too. Some viewers may find it deliberate, but I think that deliberate approach is exactly what allows the atmosphere to work. Fear grows gradually. Tension accumulates scene by scene. Emotional consequences are given room to breathe. If the movie moved faster, many of its strongest moments would lose their impact. Patience is one of the film's greatest strengths. What really stayed with me during these scenes was the growing sense that everyone is searching for something slightly different. On the surface, they're all trying to solve the same mystery. Underneath that goal, however, each person is chasing their own version of closure. Some want reassurance. Some want justice. Some want proof that the world still operates according to understandable rules. Those personal motivations add depth to the investigation because they remind us that answers are rarely just about facts. They are about what those facts mean to the people who discover them. The closer the story moves toward its larger revelations, the more emotionally complicated everything becomes. New information continues appearing, but certainty remains frustratingly out of reach. Instead of simplifying the situation, every discovery seems to reveal another layer hidden beneath the previous one. That constant expansion keeps the mystery engaging while ensuring that the emotional stakes remain just as important as the plot itself. One thing I genuinely admired about the movie is how it refuses to separate the mystery from the people experiencing it. In many films, the investigation eventually becomes more important than the characters. The audience starts focusing on clues, theories, and twists while the emotional side fades into the background. Here, the opposite happens. The mystery keeps growing, but so does the emotional weight attached to it. Every revelation matters because of how it affects the people involved. The film constantly reminds us that these are not strangers solving a puzzle. These are individuals trying to make sense of something that has completely changed their lives. As more details begin surfacing, I found myself paying closer attention to the characters rather than the clues. The clues are interesting, but the reactions are often even more revealing. Fear affects everyone differently. Some people become obsessed with finding answers. Some avoid difficult questions because they're afraid of what the answers might be. Others bounce between hope and despair depending on what happened that day. The movie captures all of those responses without making any of them feel exaggerated. Julia Garner continues delivering a performance that feels remarkably honest. What stood out to me during these scenes was how often she appears caught between conflicting emotions. There are moments where she wants to believe progress is being made, but she also seems afraid of where that progress might lead. That tension creates a fascinating internal struggle. The character is searching for truth while simultaneously worrying about what that truth might reveal. Josh Brolin's character reaches a point where determination starts becoming difficult to separate from obsession. The line between those two things is thinner than most people realize, and the film explores that idea very effectively. There were moments where I completely understood why he refused to stop pushing forward. There were also moments where I wondered whether the search itself had become more important than the outcome. That's the kind of complexity that makes a character memorable. The supporting cast continues adding depth to the story as well. One of the strengths of the screenplay is that even characters with limited screen time feel like they have lives beyond the scenes we're watching. They have their own fears, frustrations, and beliefs. Because of that, the town feels like a real place rather than a backdrop created solely for the mystery. Visually, the film remains incredibly deliberate. Nothing feels accidental. Every location seems chosen for a reason. Every shot appears designed to communicate something beyond the obvious. I kept noticing how frequently the camera would leave characters surrounded by empty space. Sometimes that emptiness reflected loneliness. Sometimes it reflected uncertainty. Sometimes it simply reminded us of who was missing. Whatever the intention, the effect was consistently powerful. Another thing I appreciated was the film's restraint. Modern horror movies often feel the need to constantly escalate. Bigger scares. Bigger twists. Bigger revelations. Weapons understands that escalation is not always about making things louder. Sometimes it's about making them more personal. As the story continues, the mystery feels larger, but the emotional focus becomes more intimate. The audience spends more time inside the fears and anxieties of the characters, which makes everything feel more immediate. The sound design continues doing excellent work in the background. Some of the most unsettling scenes are surprisingly quiet. There are moments where characters simply sit with information they've just received, and the absence of noise becomes almost unbearable. Those scenes work because the film trusts viewers to engage emotionally without constant guidance. Not every feeling needs to be announced by dramatic music. One aspect of the movie that deserves recognition is its willingness to leave room for interpretation. Many modern mysteries are obsessed with explaining everything. They want audiences to leave with complete certainty about every detail. Weapons feels more interested in creating discussion. That doesn't mean it ignores answers. Rather, it understands that some questions become more interesting once people start debating them. The best mysteries often linger because viewers continue thinking about them after the credits roll. A production fact that makes the film particularly interesting is the level of confidence the studio reportedly had in the screenplay before production began. Original horror projects rarely generate the kind of excitement usually reserved for major franchise films, yet this script became one of the industry's most talked about projects. Watching the finished movie, it's easy to understand why. The story feels ambitious without losing sight of its characters. That's a difficult balance to achieve. What I found increasingly fascinating was the way the film explores the relationship between truth and expectation. People often assume that discovering the truth will bring relief. In reality, truth can be uncomfortable. It can challenge assumptions, expose mistakes, and force people to confront realities they would rather avoid. Several characters seem to reach that realization during these scenes. They still want answers, but they no longer assume those answers will make them happy. That emotional complexity is one of the reasons the movie remains engaging. The story is not built around simple goals. Nobody is chasing a solution that neatly fixes everything. Even if the mystery is solved, the damage remains. Lives have already been altered. Relationships have already changed. The film understands that some events leave permanent marks, and it never tries to pretend otherwise. The deeper everyone digs, the clearer it becomes that understanding what happened is only part of the challenge. The harder task may be accepting what that understanding means. That's where the film becomes particularly compelling. It stops feeling like a story about finding answers and starts feeling like a story about what people do once those answers begin appearing. Some are ready for that moment. Others clearly are not. Watching these characters move closer to the truth creates a strange combination of anticipation and dread. The audience wants answers just as badly as they do, yet there's a growing suspicion that the final picture may be far more unsettling than anyone expects. That feeling hangs over nearly every scene, giving the film a sense of momentum that doesn't rely on action or spectacle. Curiosity keeps pushing the story forward, but anxiety is never far behind. The further the movie goes, the more I started noticing how carefully it balances information and emotion. A lot of mysteries become so focused on keeping secrets that they forget to keep the audience emotionally invested. Weapons never really falls into that trap. Even when the story becomes more complicated, the emotional stakes remain easy to follow because the characters are always at the center of what is happening. Every clue matters because somebody is affected by it. Every revelation changes the way people see themselves, their neighbors, or the situation they are trapped in. Something that really stood out to me was how the film handles uncertainty differently from most horror movies. Usually, uncertainty exists so the audience can eventually receive a shocking answer. Here, uncertainty almost becomes a character of its own. It influences conversations, relationships, and decisions. People begin second-guessing things they once considered obvious. They question memories, assumptions, and even their own judgment. Watching that process unfold is often more interesting than the mystery itself. Julia Garner continues to be incredibly effective because she understands how to portray someone carrying emotional weight without constantly talking about it. Some actors rely heavily on dialogue to communicate what their characters are feeling. Garner often does the opposite. There are moments where a brief look communicates more than an entire conversation. That's one of the reasons her performance feels so natural. She never appears to be explaining emotions to the audience. She simply experiences them. Josh Brolin continues bringing a different kind of energy to the story. What I found interesting is how his determination starts influencing the people around him. Obsession rarely affects only one person. It spreads outward. Friends, family members, and colleagues all end up dealing with the consequences. The film explores that idea in subtle ways. Every choice creates a ripple effect, and those ripples become larger as the pressure continues building. The screenplay also deserves credit for understanding that mysteries are not just about hidden information. They are about perspective. Two people can look at the same event and reach completely different conclusions. Throughout the movie, characters interpret the same evidence in different ways. Some see hope where others see danger. Some see answers where others see new questions. That difference in perspective creates conflict that feels believable because it grows naturally from personality rather than plot convenience. Visually, the film continues finding creative ways to maintain tension. There are scenes where the camera seems almost reluctant to move away from certain details. At first, those moments feel simple. Then you realize the movie is encouraging you to pay attention. It's asking you to look closer. Sometimes there is an obvious reason. Other times the significance doesn't become clear until much later. That approach rewards viewers who stay engaged with the story rather than passively watching events unfold. One thing I particularly appreciated was the film's use of ordinary routines. The characters still have to live their lives despite everything that has happened. They still wake up in the morning. They still go places. They still interact with other people. Yet nothing feels normal anymore. The mystery has changed the way they experience everyday life. Simple activities become difficult because fear and uncertainty are always present in the background. The movie captures that feeling extremely well. The sound design continues contributing to the atmosphere in ways that are easy to overlook. There were several scenes where I couldn't immediately explain why I felt uncomfortable. Then I realized how much work the audio was doing beneath the surface. Small sounds feel unusually noticeable. Quiet moments stretch slightly longer than expected. Nothing feels exaggerated, but everything feels deliberate. Another aspect I admired was the film's refusal to rush emotional moments. Modern movies sometimes move so quickly from one plot point to another that important reactions barely register. Weapons often pauses long enough for characters to process what they've learned. Those pauses matter because they remind us that information has consequences. Discovering a new clue is one thing. Living with what that clue means is something else entirely. A fascinating production detail is the amount of confidence surrounding Zach Cregger as a filmmaker after Barbarian. Many directors struggle when expectations suddenly increase. Audiences begin expecting every project to be bigger, smarter, and more surprising than the last one. Watching Weapons, I got the impression that Cregger was more interested in telling the story his own way than chasing expectations. The film feels ambitious, but it never feels desperate to impress. The supporting cast continues strengthening the story as well. What I liked most was that different characters represent different emotional responses to the same crisis. Some hold on to hope. Some lose faith. Some become angry. Some become withdrawn. None of those reactions feel incorrect. They simply feel human. When people experience trauma, they rarely respond in identical ways, and the film understands that. As more pieces begin falling into place, a strange feeling starts developing. The audience is still searching for answers, but curiosity is no longer the only emotion driving the experience. There is also apprehension. A growing sense that understanding the truth may not provide the comfort everyone expects. The closer characters get to connecting the dots, the more complicated the picture becomes. What makes this especially effective is that the movie never tells viewers exactly how to feel. It presents information and allows reactions to develop naturally. Some scenes feel tragic. Some feel unsettling. Some feel strangely heartbreaking. Often they feel like all three at once. That emotional complexity gives the film depth that extends beyond its central mystery. By now, it feels less like the characters are uncovering a hidden story and more like they are uncovering hidden parts of themselves. Fear reveals priorities. Loss reveals vulnerabilities. Uncertainty reveals who people become when familiar explanations stop working. The mystery remains compelling, but the human element continues to be the reason it matters. One thing that kept impressing me throughout the movie was how often it avoided the obvious choice. There were multiple moments where I expected the story to take a familiar horror movie route, and instead it chose something quieter, stranger, or more emotionally complicated. That unpredictability is one of the reasons the film stays engaging for so long. The audience never becomes completely comfortable. Just when you think you understand the direction everything is heading, another detail appears that changes the situation. What really stood out here was the growing emotional distance between characters who were once working toward the same goal. At the beginning, everyone wanted answers. That objective seemed simple enough. As time passes, however, people start developing different ideas about what finding those answers actually means. Some are searching for closure. Others are searching for someone to blame. A few seem to be searching for reassurance that the world still makes sense. Those differences create tension because people may be chasing the same truth while hoping for completely different outcomes. Julia Garner continues delivering a performance that feels remarkably grounded. By this point, her character has been through enough emotional strain that it would be easy for the performance to become repetitive. Instead, Garner keeps finding new shades within the character. There are moments where she seems stronger than before, and moments where she appears completely drained. What makes it work is that those shifts feel natural. Recovery is rarely a straight line, especially when someone is living with uncertainty. Josh Brolin remains equally compelling because his character refuses to stop pushing forward. I found myself constantly wondering whether that determination was helping him or hurting him. The film never provides a simple answer. There are times when his persistence uncovers information that nobody else would have found. There are also times when it creates friction with the people around him. That balance keeps the character interesting because he never becomes predictable. One aspect of the movie I appreciated more as it continued was the way it handled conversations. A lot of dialogue scenes serve multiple purposes at once. Characters may appear to be discussing the investigation, but they're often revealing deeper fears, frustrations, and insecurities without directly saying so. Some of the most important information in the movie isn't hidden inside clues. It's hidden inside the way people talk to each other. The cinematography continues doing excellent work during these scenes. I kept noticing how frequently characters are framed in ways that emphasize emotional isolation. Even when several people occupy the same room, they often feel disconnected from one another. The visual language reinforces what the story is already suggesting. Everyone is dealing with the same tragedy, yet everyone is experiencing it differently. Another thing I found fascinating was how the movie uses uncertainty as a source of momentum. Most films create momentum through action. Characters run somewhere, fight someone, or chase a new lead. Weapons often creates momentum through questions. The audience keeps moving forward because they need to understand what certain details mean. Curiosity becomes the engine driving the story. The sound design remains incredibly effective. There are moments where a simple background noise suddenly feels significant because the film has trained viewers to pay attention. Sometimes that feeling leads somewhere. Sometimes it doesn't. Either way, the audience stays engaged because the atmosphere encourages constant observation. It becomes difficult to relax completely, and that's exactly what the movie wants. What I also admired was the way grief continues evolving throughout the story. Early grief often feels loud and immediate. The version shown here is different. Time has passed, but pain remains. People are trying to function, trying to move forward, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy. Yet every new development forces old wounds back to the surface. The film understands that emotional recovery is rarely simple. A production fact worth mentioning is how ambitious the screenplay was considered before filming even began. Industry reports suggested that many people who read the script were impressed not only by the central mystery but also by the scope of the storytelling. Watching the movie, that ambition is easy to see. The narrative keeps expanding while still maintaining focus on individual characters. That's a difficult balance to achieve because larger stories often lose sight of the people at their center. The supporting cast continues making valuable contributions as well. One of the strengths of the ensemble is that nobody feels interchangeable. Different characters bring different perspectives, and those perspectives help the story feel larger than any single person. The mystery affects everyone differently, which makes the world feel more authentic. As more information begins surfacing, another interesting pattern becomes clear. The truth seems to exist in fragments. Nobody possesses the complete picture. One character knows something important but lacks context. Another has context but lacks crucial information. The result is a situation where everyone is carrying a piece of the puzzle without realizing how those pieces fit together. I found that idea surprisingly effective because it mirrors real life. Major events are rarely understood by one person alone. Understanding often emerges when different perspectives are combined. The movie explores that concept repeatedly, allowing separate story threads to gradually move closer together. What makes all of this so engaging is the growing realization that answers may not solve the deeper problems facing these characters. Understanding what happened is important, but understanding how to live with that knowledge may be even harder. The film keeps returning to that idea in subtle ways. People assume the truth will provide relief, yet there are increasing signs that relief and truth are not necessarily the same thing. By the time these developments unfold, the atmosphere feels heavier than ever, not because the film is getting louder or more dramatic, but because the emotional consequences continue accumulating. Every discovery carries weight. Every conversation feels important. And every step toward the truth seems to come with a new reminder that some questions change people long before they are finally answered. The more time I spent with this movie, the more I appreciated how carefully it manages expectations. Most mysteries train the audience to think in a straight line. You collect clues, eliminate possibilities, and eventually arrive at an answer. Weapons constantly challenges that way of thinking. Information arrives from different directions, often carrying emotional significance long before its practical importance becomes clear. There were moments where I found myself focusing on one question, only to realize the film wanted me to consider something completely different. That ability to redirect attention without feeling manipulative is one of the movie's greatest strengths. Something I found especially interesting was the way characters start questioning their own certainty. Earlier in the story, many people spoke with confidence. They believed they understood what was possible and what was impossible. After everything they've experienced, that confidence begins fading. The change isn't dramatic or sudden. It happens gradually, scene by scene. A person who once dismissed a theory starts considering it. Someone who trusted their memory begins doubting it. Small shifts like these make the characters feel believable because real people rarely change their minds overnight. Julia Garner continues delivering one of the most emotionally honest performances in the film. What stood out to me here was how effectively she communicates internal conflict. Her character often seems caught between hope and fear at the same time. When new information appears, there is usually a brief moment where optimism becomes possible. Then reality returns, bringing uncertainty along with it. Garner handles those transitions beautifully. Nothing feels exaggerated. Everything feels lived in. Josh Brolin's performance continues gaining strength as the emotional pressure increases. By now, it feels as though his character has reached a point where walking away is no longer an option. The search for answers has become part of who he is. That's a fascinating place to take a character because it creates both sympathy and concern. You understand why he keeps pushing forward, but you also start wondering how much of himself he's sacrificing in the process. One thing I really admired was the film's refusal to simplify people into heroes and villains. Everyone is making decisions based on incomplete information. Some choices are wise. Some are mistakes. Most fall somewhere in between. The movie understands that complicated situations rarely produce perfect responses. People react emotionally. They make assumptions. They misjudge each other. Those flaws help the story feel authentic. The visual storytelling remains incredibly effective. There are several moments where the camera seems more interested in observation than explanation. Instead of forcing the audience toward a specific conclusion, it allows us to sit with a scene and absorb its details. I always appreciate when filmmakers trust viewers enough to make their own connections. It creates a more engaging experience because you're actively participating rather than passively receiving information. The use of locations continues to impress me as well. Places we've seen before start feeling different because our understanding of the story has changed. A familiar street carries a different emotional weight. A building that once seemed ordinary suddenly feels significant. The movie does a great job showing how tragedy can permanently alter the way people view their surroundings. Nothing has physically changed, yet everything feels different. Another aspect that deserves praise is the pacing of revelations. Some mystery films become impatient near the middle, throwing answers at the audience in rapid succession. Weapons remains disciplined. It understands that timing matters. Information arrives when it can have the greatest emotional impact rather than simply the greatest plot impact. Because of that, discoveries tend to linger in your mind longer. The sound design continues supporting the atmosphere in subtle but important ways. There are scenes where almost nothing happens visually, yet the tension remains surprisingly strong. A lot of that comes from the audio. The movie knows exactly when to embrace silence and exactly when to introduce sound. Those choices guide emotions without drawing attention to themselves. One thing I kept thinking about was how much the story revolves around perception. Different characters are looking at the same situation through completely different lenses. Their experiences, fears, and beliefs shape the conclusions they reach. That idea becomes increasingly important because it suggests that understanding the truth requires more than gathering facts. It requires understanding people. The supporting cast continues contributing to that theme. Every major character seems to represent a different response to uncertainty. Some search for logic. Some rely on instinct. Some become consumed by possibilities. Others cling to whatever certainty they can find. These perspectives occasionally clash, creating tension that feels organic rather than manufactured. A fascinating element of Zach Cregger's direction is his willingness to leave emotional space inside scenes. Many filmmakers are uncomfortable with pauses. They rush toward the next line of dialogue or the next plot development. Here, characters are often allowed to simply exist within a moment. They think. They hesitate. They react. Those pauses make the emotional journey feel more realistic because life rarely moves at the speed of a screenplay. As the mystery continues unfolding, the story starts feeling less like a search for missing information and more like a confrontation with uncomfortable truths. Not all of those truths are directly connected to the central mystery. Some involve relationships. Some involve personal fears. Some involve things characters have been avoiding for years. The investigation acts almost like a pressure test, exposing weaknesses that might otherwise have remained hidden. What I found particularly compelling was the growing realization that everyone involved has been changed by the experience, regardless of how the mystery ultimately resolves. Even if answers arrive tomorrow, these people cannot simply return to who they were before. Too much has happened. Too many assumptions have been shattered. That emotional reality gives the story weight because it reminds us that consequences do not disappear once questions are answered. The film keeps building on that idea, layering emotional discoveries alongside narrative ones. Every time the audience learns something new about the mystery, we also learn something new about the people chasing it. That's a difficult balance to maintain over a long runtime, but Weapons handles it remarkably well. Curiosity keeps driving the plot forward, while empathy keeps us invested in the characters. Together, those elements create a story that feels larger than a simple puzzle waiting to be solved. As the story keeps moving forward, I found myself thinking less about individual clues and more about the overall feeling the movie was creating. That's not something that happens often. Usually, mysteries encourage you to focus on details, trying to solve everything before the characters do. Weapons certainly gives the audience plenty to think about, but it also creates an atmosphere that stays with you even when specific plot points aren't being discussed. Long after certain scenes ended, I was still thinking about how they felt rather than simply what happened in them. One of the reasons that atmosphere works so well is because the film understands the difference between fear and dread. Fear is immediate. It appears when danger is right in front of you. Dread is something else entirely. Dread grows slowly. It sits in the background of every conversation and every decision. It makes ordinary situations feel uncomfortable because you're constantly expecting something to go wrong. Throughout much of Weapons, dread becomes the dominant emotion, and the movie handles it exceptionally well. What I really appreciated was how the characters continue evolving in response to everything that's happening around them. Nobody feels frozen in place. Experiences leave marks. New information changes perspectives. Emotional wounds affect behavior. That's one of the reasons the performances remain so compelling. The actors are not simply reacting to events. They're showing how those events reshape the people experiencing them. Julia Garner continues delivering a remarkably layered performance. There were several moments where I felt like I could understand exactly what her character was thinking without her saying a word. That's a difficult skill for any actor. It requires confidence, restraint, and trust in the audience. Garner never over-explains anything. She allows emotions to exist naturally, and because of that, they often feel more powerful. Josh Brolin's character continues traveling down a path that becomes increasingly complicated. The search for answers has reached a point where it feels deeply personal. Every setback hits harder. Every new lead carries greater significance. What makes the performance interesting is that Brolin never portrays determination as something simple. His character's drive is admirable in some moments and concerning in others. The film understands that obsession rarely announces itself. It usually begins as something reasonable before gradually becoming something larger. The supporting cast continues adding depth to the world. One thing I noticed is how effectively the movie captures the feeling of a community experiencing the same crisis in completely different ways. Some people are angry. Some are exhausted. Some refuse to give up hope. Others seem emotionally drained by the constant uncertainty. These different reactions help the town feel like a real place populated by real people rather than a collection of plot devices. Visually, the movie remains incredibly confident. There are scenes where very little dialogue is spoken, yet the storytelling never loses momentum. The camera often communicates information through framing, movement, and composition. Certain shots seem designed to make characters look trapped, even when nothing is physically preventing them from leaving. That visual approach reinforces one of the film's central ideas. Sometimes people become prisoners of fear, uncertainty, or grief long before any external threat appears. I also found myself appreciating the consistency of the cinematography. A lot of movies have impressive individual shots, but not every movie develops a visual identity. Weapons feels visually coherent from beginning to end. Every creative choice seems connected to the same emotional goals. The result is a film that feels unified rather than assembled from separate pieces. Another thing worth mentioning is how carefully the screenplay manages information. There are moments where characters learn something important, but the significance of that information isn't immediately obvious. Instead of stopping to explain everything, the film allows viewers to think about it. That confidence creates a more engaging experience because the audience becomes an active participant in the mystery. One thing I found particularly interesting was how the movie explores the relationship between information and belief. Several characters are presented with facts that challenge their existing worldview. Some adapt quickly. Others resist. Some become trapped somewhere in the middle, unsure what to accept and what to reject. That struggle feels authentic because people rarely change deeply held beliefs without resistance. The film understands that truth is not always difficult to find. Sometimes it is difficult to accept. The supporting cast continues contributing meaningful perspectives to the story. What makes the ensemble work so well is that everyone seems to be fighting a different internal battle. Even when characters share the same goal, they often have completely different reasons for pursuing it. Those differences create emotional texture that keeps conversations interesting. People are not simply exchanging information. They are revealing parts of themselves, often without realizing it. A production fact that deserves attention is how ambitious the project reportedly appeared to industry readers before filming began. Many scripts attract attention because of a single clever idea. Weapons gained a reputation for being larger and more layered than a typical horror screenplay. Watching the finished film, that ambition becomes easy to recognize. The movie constantly expands its scope while maintaining a strong emotional center. That's a difficult balance, especially within a genre where atmosphere and character development often compete for attention. What impressed me most around this stage of the story was the growing feeling that the mystery had stopped being something external. Earlier, it felt like a problem waiting to be solved. Now it feels woven into the lives of the characters themselves. Their fears, relationships, and personal histories are becoming inseparable from the investigation. Every new discovery seems to reveal something not only about the mystery, but about the people chasing it. The film also deserves credit for avoiding easy emotional manipulation. There are opportunities where a less confident movie might force a dramatic reaction or an overly sentimental moment. Weapons usually chooses restraint instead. It trusts the audience to understand the significance of events without excessive explanation. That restraint makes the emotional moments more powerful because they feel earned rather than manufactured. As everything continues unfolding, a strange tension starts developing between curiosity and dread. The audience still wants answers. The characters still want answers. Yet there is an increasing awareness that answers may bring consequences nobody is prepared for. Every step forward feels important, but it also feels risky. That balance keeps the story engaging because the destination remains just as intimidating as the journey. Something that became increasingly clear to me while watching Weapons was how much confidence the film has in its audience's patience. Modern movies often feel afraid of silence, afraid of ambiguity, and especially afraid of slowing down. This film doesn't seem worried about any of those things. It understands that tension is not something that needs to be constantly announced. Sometimes tension grows because a character hesitates before speaking. Sometimes it grows because a question remains unanswered for longer than expected. And sometimes it grows because everyone in the room seems to understand that something is wrong, even if nobody can fully explain what that something is. What I found especially effective during these scenes was the way the emotional pressure keeps building without becoming repetitive. By now, every major character has been carrying the weight of the mystery for a long time. Normally, that could lead to characters feeling stuck, repeating the same emotional beats over and over. Instead, the screenplay keeps finding new ways to explore how uncertainty affects people. Some individuals become more determined. Others become more cautious. Some start questioning things they once believed without hesitation. The emotional landscape keeps evolving, which prevents the story from feeling stagnant. Julia Garner continues delivering the kind of performance that becomes more impressive the longer you watch it. There are actors who dominate scenes through intensity, and then there are actors who pull you in through authenticity. Garner belongs firmly in the second category here. Her reactions never feel calculated. She seems genuinely present in every moment. Even when very little is happening on the surface, there is always something going on behind her eyes. That subtlety gives the character depth because it feels like we're watching a person think rather than watching an actor perform. Josh Brolin remains one of the film's most compelling presences as well. What interested me most was how the story continues exploring the cost of obsession. At first, determination and obsession can look almost identical. Both involve persistence. Both involve sacrifice. The difference usually becomes visible only over time. The film spends a lot of time examining that distinction, and Brolin handles it extremely well. There are moments where you admire his refusal to quit, and other moments where you start worrying about where that refusal might lead. The supporting cast continues strengthening the world in meaningful ways. One thing I appreciated was how different characters often react differently to the same information. A new development might inspire hope in one person and fear in another. That variety makes the community feel real because people rarely process events in identical ways. Everyone brings their own history, expectations, and emotional baggage into the situation. Visually, the film remains incredibly disciplined. There are no flashy camera movements that exist purely to attract attention. Everything feels purposeful. I kept noticing how often the camera positions characters within environments that seem larger than they should. The effect is subtle, but it reinforces the feeling that people are dealing with forces they do not fully understand. Even when characters believe they are making progress, the world around them often feels vast, uncertain, and difficult to control. The cinematography also continues finding ways to make familiar places feel unsettling. That's one of the hardest things for a horror movie to accomplish. It's easy to create fear in obviously threatening locations. It's much harder to create discomfort inside ordinary settings. Weapons repeatedly succeeds because it understands that context changes everything. Once fear enters a place, that place is never experienced the same way again. Another thing I admired was how carefully the movie handles exposition. There is a lot of information floating around, but very little of it arrives through obvious explanation. Characters rarely stop to summarize what the audience already knows. Instead, details emerge naturally through conversations, discoveries, and observations. That approach requires viewers to stay engaged, but it also makes the experience feel more rewarding. The sound design deserves another mention because it continues doing remarkable work throughout the film. There were multiple moments where I felt uneasy before I could even identify why. Then I realized how much of that feeling was being created through audio. Small sounds become noticeable. Familiar sounds become slightly distorted. Silence appears at exactly the right moments. These techniques are never overused, which makes them even more effective. One aspect of the story that I found increasingly fascinating was the way it examines the human need for certainty. Most people think of certainty as a luxury, but the movie suggests it may be something closer to a necessity. Characters are willing to take risks, damage relationships, and challenge their own beliefs simply because they need answers. Not necessarily good answers. Just answers. The film repeatedly shows how difficult it is for people to live comfortably inside uncertainty. That theme gives additional weight to the mystery because it transforms the investigation into something larger than a search for facts. The characters are not just looking for information. They are looking for stability. They want to believe that the world still makes sense. Every time new information appears, they hope it will bring clarity. Instead, clarity often seems to drift even further away. A production detail that stands out when looking at the finished movie is how successfully Zach Cregger transitioned from the enormous expectations created by Barbarian. That's not an easy challenge. Audiences often expect filmmakers to repeat whatever worked previously. Weapons feels more interested in expanding ideas than repeating them. The film still embraces mystery and tension, but it approaches them from a different angle. The result feels like the work of a filmmaker trying to grow rather than simply recreate past success. What kept me invested most strongly around this point was the emotional honesty of the story. The mystery remains compelling, but the human reactions are what truly matter. Fear feels real. Frustration feels real. Hope feels real. Even the mistakes characters make feel understandable because they emerge from believable emotions rather than convenient plot requirements. As more pieces slowly move into place, the atmosphere becomes increasingly complicated. There is still curiosity, but now curiosity is sharing space with anxiety. The closer everyone gets to understanding the truth, the harder it becomes to imagine that truth bringing peace. Every new revelation carries weight. Every discovery seems connected to something larger. And every step forward creates the feeling that whatever waits at the end of this search may change far more than anyone originally expected. As everything finally starts coming together, what impressed me most was that Weapons never loses sight of the people at the center of the story. A lot of mysteries spend so much time building questions that they forget why those questions mattered in the first place. Here, even when major revelations begin to emerge, the emotional consequences remain the focus. The mystery is important, but the movie constantly reminds us that real people have been carrying the weight of that mystery from the very beginning. One thing I appreciated was that the film does not treat answers like a magic solution. In many stories, the moment the truth is revealed, everything suddenly makes sense and emotional wounds begin healing immediately. Weapons understands that life rarely works that way. Knowing what happened and learning how to live with what happened are two completely different challenges. The characters spend so much time searching for answers that they barely stop to consider what those answers might demand from them once they arrive. Julia Garner delivers some of her strongest work during the later portions of the film. What makes her performance memorable is not a single dramatic scene or emotional outburst. It is the consistency. From beginning to end, she feels like the same person reacting to increasingly difficult circumstances. Every decision, every reaction, and every moment of uncertainty feels connected to the character we met earlier. That's harder to achieve than it sounds, especially in a story where emotions are constantly shifting. Josh Brolin also leaves a strong impression. Looking back on the entire film, I think what works best about his performance is that it never asks the audience to fully agree with him or fully disagree with him. His choices are understandable even when they become questionable. His determination is admirable even when it becomes destructive. That complexity makes the character feel human. The supporting cast deserves recognition as well. One of the film's biggest strengths is that the town never feels like a backdrop. It feels alive. Every major character seems affected by the mystery in a different way, and those differences create a richer story. Rather than focusing exclusively on one perspective, the movie allows viewers to see how fear, grief, and uncertainty spread through an entire community. Visually, Weapons remains impressive all the way through. The cinematography consistently supports the emotional atmosphere rather than distracting from it. There are several images that stayed in my mind long after the movie ended, not because they were shocking, but because they carried emotional weight. The film understands that memorable visuals are not always the loudest visuals. Sometimes a simple image becomes powerful because of everything the audience associates with it. The sound design and score deserve credit too. Throughout the movie, both elements work quietly in the background, shaping the experience without constantly drawing attention to themselves. That's often the sign of strong technical filmmaking. When sound, music, editing, and cinematography all support the story rather than competing with it, the result feels more immersive. Looking at Zach Cregger's work as a director, it becomes clear why there was so much anticipation surrounding this project. Following Barbarian was never going to be easy. Expectations were incredibly high. What I respect most is that Weapons does not feel like a filmmaker trying to repeat a previous success. It feels like someone exploring bigger themes, larger ideas, and more ambitious storytelling. Whether every viewer connects with every creative decision will depend on personal taste, but the ambition is impossible to ignore. Another thing that stayed with me was how much the movie trusts its audience. It does not constantly explain itself. It does not stop every few minutes to clarify what viewers should be thinking. Instead, it allows people to engage with the mystery, draw conclusions, and form their own interpretations. That confidence makes the experience more rewarding because it turns the audience into active participants rather than passive observers. What ultimately makes Weapons stand out is not the mystery alone. There have been plenty of mysteries before and there will be plenty after. What makes this film memorable is the way it connects that mystery to recognizable human emotions. Fear, grief, obsession, hope, regret. The story works because those emotions feel authentic. Even when events become strange or unsettling, the people experiencing them remain believable. By the time the credits roll, the movie leaves behind more than a collection of clues and answers. It leaves behind ideas. Questions about certainty. Questions about loss. Questions about how far people are willing to go when they desperately need the world to make sense again. Those themes give the film weight beyond its plot. If I had to summarize my overall experience, I would say Weapons succeeds because it understands that the scariest mysteries are rarely about monsters, ghosts, or shocking twists. The scariest mysteries are often the ones that force people to confront parts of themselves they would rather avoid. Throughout the film, characters search for answers, but in many ways they are also discovering who they become when certainty disappears. For me, that's what makes the movie worth discussing. The mystery grabs your attention, but the characters keep it. The atmosphere creates tension, but the emotional honesty gives that tension meaning. And when those elements come together, the result is a film that stays in your mind long after it ends. That's my review of Weapons, 2025. What started as a mystery about missing children gradually turned into something much bigger, exploring fear, grief, obsession, and the desperate need for answers when the world stops making sense. It's the kind of movie that gives you plenty to think about after the credits roll, and whether you end up loving every decision it makes or not, it's hard to deny how ambitious and memorable the experience is. If you've already watched Weapons, let me know what you thought about it. Did the mystery work for you? Were there any moments that completely caught you off guard? I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this review, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future movie reviews, breakdowns, and behind-the-scenes facts. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next review.